Welcome to BLO's Town Hall, The Impact of Opera, the opera Madama Butterfly on Artists and Audiences. My name is Rebecca Kirk, and I'm the Director of Community and Learning for Boston Lyric Opera. This work is part of a holistic year-long process, the Butterfly Process, and one of a 6-part discussion series, an opportunity for community learning and dialogue. Thanks to our long-standing partnership with the Boston Public Library for hosting us today. Before we begin, I will give you a brief overview. Today's session will be 90 minutes. The discussion centers the experience of opera artists and audiences and explores the complex, sometimes conflicting relationship many people have to Madama Butterfly, both as a gateway to the opera and a work that has typecast many AAPI singers. We will explore the ways in which the opera productions can be more inclusive and multicultural. Phil Chan will lead the conversation with featured speakers Wynne Szeto, EIji Miura, Melanie Bacaling, and Todd McNeel to contextualize these themes and frame a community discussion with BLO artists who are engaged with us for this year-long process. Thank you to the COVID plan developed by BLO's Health Task Force for Opera Artists that has ensured that we are keeping everyone safe in person here today, healthy and as possible. As a community guest, you are with us virtually today, and your role is equally important. We invite you to watch, listen, and hold space for these important conversations. I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath in, and then slowly release it, grounding in this present moment. We each come here today as people holding multiple identities from many different places and together in this physical and virtual space. At Boston Lyric Opera, we live and work on the traditional and ancestral and unceded lands of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts peoples. We recognize the colonization these lands continue to affect the original inhabitants of this land after more than 400 years. Before we invite Phil and our featured speakers to begin, I invite you, if you haven't already done so, to read and acknowledge our community agreements. They were provided on the slides at the beginning of this event, included in your confirmation information, and are also available on our website. We're providing them in the chat now for your reference. These community agreements are created to support all of us here today to hold a safe space, even though we all can't see each other. Thank you for honoring these agreements. We acknowledge that the content of this discussion series may be sensitive and triggering to some. We encourage you to participate and engage to the extent that you are most comfortable. BLO has partnered with the AWARE Lab at Boston University School of Social Work, and they have generously shared resources for our community to seek additional support, particularly those in our community who identify as AAPI and BIPOC. You can find these resources on our website. A few housekeeping things. There's an opportunity to submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A feature. We may not have time to answer all the questions submitted. We have enabled the closed captioning feature for this webinar. You may choose to hide or show by clicking the icon next to the Q&A feature. Additional information about the butterfly process, including the bios of our featured speakers, can be found on blo.org. If you missed the first 2 discussions in the series, you may watch them anytime for free on operabox.tv. This session will be available to stream next week, accessible through the Boston Public Library and Boston Lyric Opera. Thank you for being with us here today, and now I will invite Phil and our featured speakers to begin today's discussion.
I'm particularly excited about this session, not just because we're in person, but also because we're really looking at the specific impact of Madama Butterfly as a work. And I thought it'd be really interesting to get a sort of cross-section of the larger opera community by inviting a board member, by inviting an educator, inviting someone from the marketing team, and a creative producer to all weigh in on the different impacts that this work might have on your community and the sort of dialoguing between each other, which we don't often get in the arts, talking across these different groups about how we can build a larger audience for a work like Madama Butterfly. So first, it'd be lovely to maybe go down and have each panelist give like a couple minute introduction about where they are in this opera ecosystem, and also their relationship with Butterfly. So Winnie, since you're right here, why don't we kick it off with you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Wynne Szeto. I am on the board of advisor of BLO. I am a scientist, a molecular biologist to be specific by training. So I have no hands-on experience in the artistic performing arts section. My only reaction is from the audience point of view. I do love opera. I have seen Madama Butterfly quite a few times with different butterflies. My concept of this opera is that it's not particularly exotic because I was brought up in the East and I'm used to seeing that. I think the essence of the story is about a very young girl who is trapped by circumstances to make decisions that are not very wise. But she's very courageous because she doesn't listen to people. She acts out on what she believes is right. She cuts herself off from her family, her friends, her community, and she decides to marry this white guy, which it's probably a very big no-no, even to this day. And when things didn't work out for her, she's extremely disappointed. And after securing what she believes would be a good future for her son, she kills herself because, and this is in the final act of the opera, the last aria of the opera. She says, he dies in honor, who cannot no longer live with honor. And that to me really summarizes Butterfly. Again, I think that this story transcends race and age and whatever, because it can happen to anybody, to any girl, as long as there is a big power differential and poverty. And I think it's still happening today. And so it moves me very much. And of course, Puccini has written a beautiful score from the butterfly entrance to the love duet, to the humming chorus, to Butterfly's final act. That makes the story more poignant.
Great, thank you, Winnie. AAPI?
Hello, everybody. My name is AAPI Miura. I am a singer and an educator. I currently am on faculty at the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley. On the voice faculty, I instruct studio voice, and I also lecture diction courses, and I'm the managing director of the Summer Opera Intensive in Valencia, Spain. Outside of that, I'm also on faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I work for the Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, and Human Rights at Harvard University. My relationship to Butterfly is very personal. I got my first big national break as Goro in a Japanese English adaptation of Madama Butterfly. And through that process, which actually was, it's not technically the first bilingual Japanese English production of Butterfly, but I think the way that we framed it was the first true to story. How would have Chojo-san and Pinkerton communicated with each other? What it would have actually been like. So we've kind of framed it in this first true to story bilingual production, but through that process, had a lot of evolutions of thought throughout engaging with this piece of art, from thinking, how can I give my character more dimension, right? Is that we've written off Asian males entirely in this work. as contributors to Chocho-san, not just her downfall, but how the United States has really affected the country politically and socially, to things like Puccini didn't write enough music for me to take my shoes on and off when I'm running in and out of Chocho-san's house trying to cater to Pinkerton and Sharpless. So it's really interesting for me to be a part of this discussion now, also as an educator, where I'm trying to make space for young AAPI folks and other BIPOC singers, but also as someone who has experienced this beautiful work. And I agree that it is a universal story of white man goes to foreign country and wreaks havoc on Native women's livelihood. So I'm happy to be here with you all today to have this discussion, and I'm excited to see where this takes us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Todd McNeel. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a singer and arts administrator, but today I'm here as Boston Lyric Opera's Senior Manager of Marketing and Communications. So my role in the entire Butterfly process production is on the promotional side and how we educate and prepare our audiences for each discussion and for each event. And then I'm on the post-discussion side. As Rebecca had mentioned earlier, my team is charged with making sure that it's up and available on operabox.tv. So another operabox.tv plug as my job. It is available for you all to view the first two discussions, whether you joined us the first time or if you were not able to. Both discussions are up on operabox.tv for free. And this one will be up shortly after this conversation.
Hello, I'm Melanie Bacaling, pronoun she, her, hers. I am a director, producer, stage manager in the opera world, former singer, recovering singer, maybe I should say. And my relationship to Madama Butterfly, I have seen it many times, but particularly for this project and process, I am directing a wonderful new concert docu-series, we're calling it, with these fantastic artists on the stage here with us, that will be coming to operabox.tv shortly. And this was, as you may have been following along with this process, supposed to be a concert that we would have been presenting around this time, but we have since pivoted, and I'm very excited for the work we've been doing as a group and as a collective to not only talk about what we've talked about in the previous conversations, but how we can help move this art forward with the topics that we've discussed. So that's that.
Well, then let's start with you.
Great.
I guess I'm sort of wondering, since today's session is focusing on the impact of artists, what are some things that you as a creative think about in a work like Butterfly, but more generally when there's a story that takes place over there or has maybe a way of portraying race that we don't do anymore?
Yeah.
As a creative, how do you approach works like that to make sure that it's hitting with audiences the way that the creator intended?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the process that I like to take on personally when it comes to taking on any opera and you know, especially if it deals with any sort of matter of race or stereotyping or any sort of social, political situations, which I will argue that probably most operas do have all of those situations in them, especially if you dig hard enough and look at the historical context in which they were created. And that's actually something that I love about the work that I do, is finding you know, the motivating factors around what is the climate when this work was written, and to approach that respectfully and sensitively, and asking myself, how would this resonate with an audience in 2022? And what is the significance of bringing this work and working with a whole bunch of artists to bring this work to an audience? What are the implications of that? And so something with, you know, Madama Butterfly that I've been contemplating a lot is, yes, and talking about how universal of a story it is, like that is beautiful. The music is undoubtedly gorgeous, and it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But something that I have also considered is, you know, especially as a female director, how much do I want to put on another piece of art on stage that has a young woman dying at the end? You know, how much do I want to depict a story in which, you know, we're telling something else of a young girl having to kill herself over heartbreak? Like I consider all of these things in the storytelling that I hopefully choose or do not choose to do. And so part of my process is kind of having these sort of discussions, but with myself. So it's really nice that we're doing all of this together as a community, and being able to consider all those impacts, because I think it's really important to constantly question, is this something that is relevant? Is it not relevant? Why is it not relevant? How do we make it relevant? Maybe it's not. And also something that I like to consider too is, who is the community in which this is being presented? Is it in Boston, and what does the relationship look like there? And I think for a lot of my creative colleagues, we can, relate to being, a little bit nomadic, maybe a few freelance, going between different companies in different cities. So that can be a little bit more of a challenge, is getting to know the place in which you are creating. Gratefully, I have lived in Boston for a while. I am an alumna of the Boston Conservatory, so I feel like Boston specifically is a community that I adore and love, and has been great to consider the work that we've been doing with the I don't know that we've made that totally clear. So our concert docuseries, and considering the Boston community in that.
I love what you're saying about this, this questioning what this idea of a woman dying at the end. I just remember, have you guys seen Call Me by Your Name? During when I saw that movie, because it takes place, it's a gay movie that takes place in the 80s, I just said, oh, someone has to die of AIDS. Because that's what happens. That's every gay movie that happens in this period. Somebody is punished for and dies of AIDS. So when the whole time I was holding my breath, and when the movie ended and nobody died of AIDS at the end, I was sort of like, wait, what happened? It was shattering that repeating narrative that was in the water about that particular story. And I think that's also a very generative place too. If you can break a specific story that's been told over and over again with a new twist,
Absolutely.
that can also kind of make it fresh. I'm curious, Todd, for you as someone who actually has to then take a work that a creative has made and sell it to the audience, depending on various degrees of comfort with the work, knowledge of the work, and especially around works that might have at least be a lightning rod for race, like a work like Madama Butterfly in recent years has become. How do you sell that to the community? How do you get people to feel included and want to actually come and be challenged by a work like Butterfly?
Yeah, so I love sitting in on meetings whenever we bring in the creative team or the directors, because it gives me time to sit with their vision and learn their vision. So after we have sort of like a design presentation, I think about the points of connectivity. So how can I take this piece and make it universal, make it relatable? How can I emotionally and mentally prepare an audience for the work or the production of the event that they're about to engage with? And then, specifically for this project and this iteration of Butterfly, fully being transparent that, we acknowledge and appreciate the work and the music, but we also recognize that, it has a complicated history that needs to be re-examined. And so, how do we, honor and cater to our core audience that, will appreciate Madama Butterfly for how it's always been presented, while welcoming in new and diverse audiences, and just, inviting conversation and varying opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. And also a similar perspective, also somebody who is in charge of bringing in new audiences. As a board member, you're not only trying to bring in new audiences, get new fans for the company, you're also trying to raise money from this crowd. And so with a work like Madama Butterfly, where people have very strong feelings about it one way or the other, what are some challenges for you as a board member in terms of bringing people in?
Well, opera goers are not usually about race. Either they like opera or they don't. And for those who don't like opera, you just have to drag them in. You just have to say, okay, do me a favor. You're my friend, come once. And that works. However, if I bring them to an opera, which is kind of, say, okay, Strauss. I have a friend who saw Salome. And she told me, I've seen Salome and I will never go to an opera again. And I'm saying, okay. So I brought
She
her.
doesn't like veils, huh?
I don't know what her issues are, but
Too many veils.
but she's a dear person. She's really nice, caring, wonderful person. So anyway, after buying her a ticket, giving her, bringing her, I dragged her to see our Barber of Seville. And so she says, wow, is this opera? I like opera. Okay, then. So I guess what I'm saying is that you have to be careful. I mean, with Madama Butterfly, from my audience poll, most people react very strongly to the music. They say it is a beautiful score. And in fact, I have only heard from one person who said that. I asked him, what is your first, like the question you asked, what is your first reaction to Butterfly? I've only had one person who say that is exotic. So most people get over that. I've had, the most common reaction is that it's the beautiful music. The second is that, how do I put it nicely? Pinkerton is a cad and a coward. I mean, that's common. And then third is that Butterfly is not submissive. She is incredibly strong. She makes her decisions. If she is submissive, she would listen to her family, to Goro and Mary Yamadori and all that. But no, she makes the decision. She will not do that. She gives the son to Pinkerton, but then she dies by the samurai way. So, a lot of people see that. And I think that, and one person said it's a chick flick. So you have to I guess, depending on the person that you're bringing to the opera, you have to find, like the marketing, whatever they are about, and to get them to listen to you. And sometimes there is no choice but to do it by brute force, which I do. But usually it works because, people are actually much more open than we think they are. And in operas like Butterfly and things like that, when I sit in the audience, say at the Met or another, in Yen or whatever, when I talk to the people and if they make some racist comment, I would be there to correct them. I would tell them that, no, this is not the way it is. And of course you do it nicely, you don't hit them over the head or anything, and I think that they're receptive, generally quite receptive, because I think opera goers are generally nice people. If they spend all that money to buy an opera, to buy a ticket to go sit in the orchestra or wherever they sit, I mean, they're not likely.
They're not internet trolls.
No, they're not like. But having said that, I think that it is important to remember that they look for entertainment, and that's a key point. So you have to have a good production, a high production value. You can't just schlock in someone and say, this is it. They would know that. If you put in a bad singer to sing Cho-Cho-san, they would know that, and they would remember you, and they would say, no, I'm not coming again. And Melanie, to address your point, sometimes, well, in opera, a lot of young women die anyway. I was thinking, like in my head, most of them die anyway in the end, right? But that's not the point. The point is, we need to maintain a sort of level of dramatic tension. Just because something is bad doesn't mean we shouldn't show it. It is that we shouldn't glorify it. If the production makes a point of something bad, a bad action, in a very dramatic way, then it's okay. Promotes the drama forward. There are some productions that I sit through. I say, I can't take this anymore. And I like opera. It's too boring. So whatever it is, we have to remember, and the audience is the ultimate validation of your production, whatever, right? They're the ones who buy the ticket, who support you. So you have to please them somehow, regardless of whatever it is that you do.
Well, let's think about that pipeline a little bit more for a second. So I'd love to focus on maybe the impact on an opera like Madama Butterfly on young singers. I know AG talked about how Butterfly was a vehicle for your kind of big break, and we did a call with the Asian Opera Alliance recently, and I said, oh, everyone, let's all go around and introduce each other. And they all laughed and they said, Phil, we all know each other because we've all done butterfly. I've done 3 butterflies with him in Tucson. I've done 4 butterflies with her. Like there's this community built around butterfly as an unintended consequence of this being such a prominent opera in the repertory. So I'd love to hear the impact on maybe young singers that you work with who are trying to find their place and maybe might not identify with Cho-Cho-san as a role or a Turandot as a role.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I think it's, well, we can look at this from several different perspectives. I think the first thing is this concept of pigeonholing, right? And I think, you know, any young singer is happy to have work. And at the beginning of a career, you just say yes to everything until you burn out. And then, and then hopefully your career will have picked up enough for you to be selective about what kinds of contracts you get to say yes and what you get to say no to. But there's definitely this trope of you say yes to one Cho-Cho-san, you say yes to one Goro, and then you end up singing Goro and Ping, Pang, and Pong for the rest of your career, right? And so, and people have had entire careers of singing Cho-Cho-san and never get cast to sing Mimi, or never get cast to sing Countess. And they should be singing these roles because they're vocally just as competent as everyone else singing these roles, but you know, a casting director says, aha, I know someone who's done a fabulous Cho-Cho-san here, we just fly them on out, they already know the role. And I think so, yes, this is beautiful music, yes, this is a timeless story, yes, it should be told, and yes, we should be hiring these singers to sing other roles, right? So there's that issue. And then I was thinking about this the other day, and Melanie and I were chatting a bit about there is this tacit understanding that the talent pool of BIPOC artists is not quite as large as our white colleagues, right? And so, well, you know, we tried to hire someone to sing this role at AAPI person, right? Someone who identifies as Asian American, but we just couldn't do that. So we hired, you know, the next best singer who happens to be white. And then we have this conversation about what is the cause of this lack of BIPOC artists in the pool of talented professional singers? And it really stems back to access and opportunity. And of course, you know, making space and creating scholarship opportunities for students at the educational level, but also on a grander scale, we have to make the industry a lot more livable for artists, right? And so relying on the generous donation of a board or somebody who is a regular opera goer is not a sustainable model. And so, you know, the obvious solution to this is publicly subsidizing the arts and creating a system in which people can actually make a salary and health insurance by engaging in these artworks. Right?
I just heard an entire sigh of artists here, like everyone just went,
right?
Ah.
You know, and we know it can be done because Europe has figured it out, right? But then the other part of this conversation that Mel and I were having was that then we have to also address the cultural problem of the scarcity mindset. At least I can speak from experience as an Asian American person, is that my immigrant father was like, doctor, lawyer, scientist, what are you going to be that's going to be lucrative, right? And I don't think that's just an AAPI narrative. I think that's a Latinx narrative. I think that's a Black American narrative. I think that's a narrative for so many people who come from historically disadvantaged backgrounds. And so, you know, we don't see, I was the only Asian American male in my entire vocal education. From high school, I went to performing arts high school, to undergrad, to graduate school. And I was the only Asian American male in my entire schooling. I never saw people like me on stage. I never shared the stage with people like me. I never got to sing in my native language until this butterfly that I did, which was really fabulous. But I always had this lingering scarcity mindset that was just preventing me from really fully engaging in this artwork that I love so much, right? So how do we dispel, how do we remove this scarcity mindset from these communities? And again, the answer is making it a more livable career. So I'm trying to do that at school. I'm trying to engage in these dialogues with my colleagues, with administrators. My work with the committee at Harvard really specializes and is focusing on creating space and highlighting the voices of these communities, and also decolonizing scholarship, and what does that look like, and making space for non-traditional ways of thinking, because we think of the monolith as the monograph as the epitome, right? You write your dissertation, it's published, I write a book. That is scholarship, right? But how is this not scholarship? How is this dialogue we're having not scholarship? And how is my lived experience not important enough to be contributing to higher thinking, right? So from a high level, I think that's where the work begins, but please register to vote. Vote in your local elections, vote in your state elections, vote in your national elections, vote for people who support the arts, right? This is how we change the arena to support not just, any old community of singers, but all, singers from all backgrounds and all identities. So that's kind of my pedestal right now.
Well, so one of the things that I'm most interested in our rehearsal we had last week was actually quite interesting for me to watch, was the chance to give the panelists to ask each other some questions, because they're often, folks are siloed in their own departments or in their own particular areas, and there isn't always some, cross-cultural discussion among roles. So I know you guys all had questions for each other, and just want to see if anyone wanted to go first and kick us off. Go ahead, Mel.
Right. Wynne, we had, no, don't laugh at me. No, one of the things that that we had in our pre-discussion brought up was the fact that oftentimes creative teams, when creative companies bring creative teams in, don't really get a chance to be in dialogue with the board until the product has been made. And then sometimes like opinions want to be shared and everything like that. So when he brought up a point in that she would actually like to be in dialogue more with us and the work that we make. So Wynne, I ask, what would you like to see in that sort of relationship building?
I just would like to see, I think that is helpful for any production when you have an artistic idea, just not to run it just by the board. I mean, by your friends, anybody, just to say, well, this is what I want to do, and this is how I'm going to do it. Does it sound good to you? Does it convince you? Most of the time it does, but there are times that, your concept flies so high above somebody else that, I have no idea what you're trying to communicate, because in the science, we were taught that when we give a talk, you have to you begin by saying your statement, saying your intent. This is what I intend to do. And then you repeat it and you repeat it. And then you give the evidence to support it. So this is in a creative, you say, this is what I intend to do with this story. I want to tell a story of race in America. And so you tell people, why do you want to do that? Because, my first reaction to someone telling me that I should sit down and listen to something is that, why is it interesting, and why should I listen to you? And that is the key part. I mean, really. So the more you can do it with anybody, the better your final product would be. I mean, and talk not just to artists, to people outside of the field, because oftentimes they have a completely different perspective and can be extremely valuable.
Yeah,
that's what I would do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it would be so interesting to be able to have an earlier dialogue with board members so that we can talk just like this, because it's just so nice for me getting to actually get to meet you and know you. And I yes, thank you, BLO. Right. but it's funny though, Winnie, because you saying, you know, we don't have anything to do with the artist, but you fuel what we're able to do, right? And I feel that pressure immensely when it comes to the product that's made and the actual vision, because I'm like, well, shoot, if the board doesn't like it, that's not a good thing, you know. So it has this interesting. Sure. Yeah. But having the dialogue, I think, is lovely.
It's always very helpful.
Yeah.
People on your side just to solicit their opinion, and I wish there would be a formal way to do this. Other than, you know, just after the fact, what we listen to, you know, I have to say it's 50-50. When I listen to the presentations, the opera deconstruction, sometimes I said, what the heck are they trying to sell to do, you know, and I don't know. And, you know, of course you keep quiet because it's my opera. I have to support it, right? But no, I mean, it would be a whole lot better. Like I said, it would be a whole lot better for us too, if we have to bring new audience to the opera. What, you know, like I said, what if you bring them to something that, like, if I don't like it, how am I going to convince other people to like it, right? So yeah, that's kind of important, I think, communication. I mean, I always, much as I hate it, I always ask my daughter for the young people's point of view as to, you know, what are you guys thinking, you know, that the 30s crowd, because I believe that they are the future. You know, if you look at the graphs all these consultants give us, I mean, you know, you start out not liking opera, and then you by age, you grow up. That's because, you know, you have to work, you have no money. Then you get a little bit more educated, you know, then you have a little bit more cash, you spend it. And then when you come to my age, you retire, you have all the time in the world, you know, and you can afford to go. So that, but to develop that audience is that, you know, between, I would say 30 to 40, that age is very important, but because those are the people, they make quite a bit of money at this stage in life. And they spend it. If they like it, they don't. I mean, they won't. My daughter, for example, and her cousin she flew to LA to meet her cousin to go to the premiere of Il Trovatore. Now, how many people, I wouldn't do that. How many people would do that? But that's an example for you, is that if they want to, they will.
It was a great production, by the way.
So there's
Yeah,
a soliciting of diverse opinions. It sounds like that opera companies need to do too. It's not just asking the opinions of what does our board think,
Yeah.
but also what do the other,
Absolutely.
what is the next generation, and that will inform
Yes.
what the production is
Exactly.
for the
Because the board
community.
usually are very stuck in their way. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, they've been there. It's just the way we have done things for.
So Todd, how does that work in practice?
Yeah, I was about to say, audience development is a big part of my job, my team. We're constantly thinking of, like, as I had shared earlier, you know, how do we maintain our core audience, but how do we welcome in new audiences? So specifically for marketing, I think about what are my emails communicating? What is the website communicating? What are we saying on social media that, you know, states that this is a place that everyone is welcomed? We know that, like, folks in the country are, like, music education is not what it used to be when we were all growing up. So some people don't know, like, what a voice part is or what an instrument is. It's just like, how can I make the messaging less tactful and just speaking to the experience and the emotion of the piece? And then also, how can so acquisition is a big thing. I've got these new audiences, but then retention, how do I keep them coming in? How do I make them, you know, multi-ticket buyers? How do I eventually maybe encourage them, you know, to opt in to become a subscriber? And so it's just, you know, speaking to the emotion of the piece, it's speaking to the experience, and really just debunking and decentering, you know, what opera used to be, and letting folks know that, you know, Boston Lyric Opera is a place that welcomes all people. We're not just reaching out to you because we think that you're interested in this show, but how do we keep inviting you to come back and enjoy the opera?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm curious to see if that's a conversation that you have as part of a greater strategic plan meeting with the entire company. Is artistic involved in that? Do you get to ask of the directors to say, here are our audience goals, and how can you, the artistic team, be a part of this audience development process? Is that something that happens? I'm just really curious about how that works.
Yeah, I would say we have internal meetings all the time that are cross-departmental. And so it's not just living in the marketing and sales department, but making sure that I'm connecting with my colleagues in production or my colleagues in artistic. And sometimes I think of like fun social media campaigns. So thinking, okay, it'd be really great. Melanie is like a great person for this. It's like you are really passionate about the project. And so I want to promote this production. And I think folks would love to hear from the director, or folks would love to hear from the designer, or from the light designer, or whoever made the costumes, or who made the set. So it's just thinking, as I said, thinking of different entry points or points of connectivity. That's not just like, oh, this is great because we said it's great and the Boston Globe said it, but it's like, hear from us, hear from our team. And so Boston Lyric Opera is constantly meeting internally and not just siloed about, how can we broadcast and, communicate externally all the things that we're doing.
Just a comment on that. I think that's something that's really great. And just thinking about like the theme of this discussion and the impact specifically of the butterfly process on audiences, something that has been a plus of making this like online and not just for the Boston community, although obviously like we're rooted here, of course. But I think something that has been an impact on the audiences is to show that a company is actually invested in that investigative process to do the difficult work that it takes to call out why something is or is not problematic, and having productive dialogue about it, and not just saying like, oh, well, we don't like this because some people say it's racist, so we're not going to do it again. Like just canceling it isn't always the best answer, because then there's no grace for learning, right? And if we're not learning, how are we actually moving the art form forward? So I feel like just a comment, I guess, that I'm making right now is I think that's something like this where we're doing, having these conversations and dialogue with one another. Transparently, totally is actually impacting audiences, hopefully for the better. And maybe like I'm sure that the team is researching whether or not that's actually happening, but it's exciting to me to know that the audience is in mind when it's so process oriented and not just the product of this is what we have on stage and this is what we're doing, but hey, let's invite you into how we're going about this for whatever the future might be, is just very exciting to me.
Now, speaking of inviting people in, I also wanted to now take this opportunity to invite our artists into this conversation who've been sitting here quietly. So snaps to our lovely singers. I got to sit in on a rehearsal with them earlier today with a few of them, and boy, we've got some dynamo talent over here. So also wanted to open up the floor to you guys to maybe ask any questions of the panelists. I'll just, while you guys are thinking of something to say, we do have a couple questions from those of you at home. And so any of you panelists feel like you want to pick this up. But the question was, do we as Americans need to consider why we present differently from other countries or other communities? How are we expressing culture and race in a way that maybe they might do differently in Europe or in Asia? So any questions, any answers for the audience on that theme?
Yes, I know. I look at AJ because he and I have had many conversations about this. But to a point that I had made earlier about considering the place in which we're telling stories and then the audience that makes up that community who will be receiving the story, I think we as Americans, or whomever the identity is, I'm Filipino American, like how does that impact the audience? And you can't just not factor in the time and place in which the community is residing. And I think that makes it very specific to the way that a Madama Butterfly would be presented to an American audience versus one that would be done in Japan or Korea, perhaps. And
I have a ton of things to say about this, but I will keep it brief. I think this notion of cross-culturalism is really interesting, right? And looking at this from a lens of, I am of a certain time and place, and I'm engaging with a work of art that is from a different time and place, but is about a time and place that is not that time and place. So, you know, we have this, it's a constant dialogue. It's a constant dialogue. And I think it's, and I will use myself as an example. I'm Japanese American. I'm also biracial, right? And I have really grappled with this nomenclature of being half Japanese, half white, which makes me feel not whole of either. So when I go to Japan, I speak perfect Japanese. It is my first language. I was a citizen until I was 20, right? Dual citizen, and I will never be seen as Japanese, right? And I will go into a restaurant and I will order my meal in a perfect Japanese, and the waiter will respond to me in broken English, right? And that's something that I've dealt with there, and it's a little more overt there. But I also, you know, I'm half white, and I will acknowledge that. But I'm not white presenting, and I will never live the experience of a white person. So it's interesting to use that understanding and say, my experience through my schooling as the only Asian American male is different than somebody who, say, grew up in Asia and then came to the United States, because they spent their whole lives in their home country in a, you know, relatively homogeneous nation where they saw people who looked like them growing up their entire lives, and then later in life as an adult become the minority. Whereas I've lived my entire life as the minority. And so this is a really interesting idea of representation. What does that mean? And is it the same thing to outsource your chocho-san from abroad than it is to bring in an Asian American chocho-san? And what does that storytelling mean from a philosophical and social point of view? I think it's important for young people to see people who look like them, right? To see themselves on stage. But then the next part of that dialogue, I think, is where's this person from, and do they have the same experience that I have? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's absolutely something that is worth considering and engaging with going forward.
I think as someone who grew up in Hong Kong, my own experience with seeing Chinese representation in Hong Kong, like there were on TV, there were rich Chinese people and poor Chinese people and smart Chinese people and dumb Chinese people, you know, and then I came to America and there was like the one image of Chineseness that was not nuanced, and it was a caricature, and it was one specific lane, and it was always Long Duck Dong, right? Whereas in China, you could have Long Duck Dong, but also love interests, right? Other people, you know, and it wasn't. It was just like a clown versus the only image, right? And I think one of the impacts that we're seeing with Madama Butterfly is that it is such a strong narrative of Japaneseness, and it has so informed for literally over 100 years how we view not just Japanese people, not just Japanese women, but all of Asia, all Asian people. It's one of those big works. And so unpacking, you know, the warts and all of that depiction on real people when it's meant to be a fantasy, I think is where we're seeing a lot of the friction and a lot of the challenging aspects of this work as a racialized work. Right. Any of you artists have any questions?
No, I just think that particular point of sign. Love this guy. Is this good? Is this working? Great. Just the thing that jumped out at me that you said was this idea of nuance within a particular racial group, or any group for that matter, where if you're not a member, or if you don't grow up surrounded by that myriad of depictions and that multitude of peoples, I think that can be very problematic when you're presenting
a kind of racial reflection to outsiders because they're only seeing this one sliver. And there can be such a wide variety of peoples within a particular group. And I mean, we see this within opera singers, you know, people will just see one kind of depiction of opera singers or classical musicians, but to those of us that work in this industry, we know the wide variety of personalities, of varying views, of artistic backgrounds. So I think it was really interesting. And I think it was interesting to hear you state that, but I think that's the beautiful purpose of art is, can we bring that level of nuance to various groups? And you see this, you know, in television now to some extent. People would say that we're in the golden era of TV because you have Netflix and Amazon and various stories that are told that maybe weren't necessarily told 20 years ago. And there's still a lot of room for growth in that particular regard. But it was just interesting to hear you say that, and interesting from my perspective to see an opera company even attempt to have that conversation, because that's something that's very seldom done. And I talked to Mel about this before in our initial interview when we were just talking about this project. I forget what you asked me, but it was something of, I don't know, my views on race or this opera project, or have there been like issues with like racial depiction in this career field? And I was very honest and kind of cynical, and like, I never expected anybody in this field to grapple with these questions. I went into this industry with very low expectations. I just knew it was something I liked and I loved. And I knew there were other famous Black singers that had done beautiful things in this industry and were singing for heads of state and European royalty when you'd have to go back to the Jim Crow South, and that wasn't even an opportunity. So it's interesting because one of the things I realized working on this project is maybe I've set my expectations a little bit too low without even realizing it. And how do I kind of reanalyze that and be a little bit more vocal? Because it's a little bit scary to kind of say what you think when you're in an industry where you feel like there's not even a possibility of being able to state that. I mean, you talked about your co-creator, the co-founder of Final Bow to Yellowface, and you made this one comment in one of our Zoom meetings where you said that she had said things that you weren't necessarily supposed to say. You were talking about her book, and I don't know if I'm overstepping bounds. I hope I'm not.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking, oh, I want to pick up that book and see, because it is something that we all have to walk this kind of political tightrope, regardless of race. I mean, when you're in any industry, that's just how it is. You have to know how to play the game. But it's hard in the arts because you have to be true to yourself and you have to be your authentic self and show this kind of emotional, artistic truth. And how do you do that and still play the game and still survive as an artist? And it's a lot to sort of grapple with. Anyway, that just jumped out at me, this idea of nuance, and how do we show the various levels of nuance in any industry, in any context, and how can art do that? And I think it's been really great to attempt that in the first place, because that's something I never really thought I'd have the opportunity to do. So
I think one of the things we're trying to shift with both this conversation at large, but also I think BLO is trying to, as an organization, change is thinking about, when we're presenting works, whose point of view are we choosing? And if historically it's only been through a Eurocentric lens, so the way Europeans saw Africa, the way Europeans saw Asia, right? Yet so many of us don't have that singular Eurocentric view. Like, we just don't, or experiences. And so, if we're looking around and we're saying we are a multicultural stage, we're a multicultural city, yet we're still presenting opera through this one small specific perspective, how do we expect to build audiences? How do we expect to be bigger when we're limiting ourselves to a very small way of thinking? So this idea of multiracial, I don't think it means cancel culture. We're not getting rid of Butterfly. We're keeping the work alive, but it has to be through an additional 1 or 2 or 3 or more perspectives. and challenge what the notes that are on the page to make them bigger.
You mentioned this thing that I think is especially worth highlighting for the AAPI community is that we are often lumped into this one designation of Asian, right? And if you think about what population of the earth is actually Asian, and you come to the surprising number of half of the entire world is Asian people, right? And so we often are this notion of identity is two-pronged, right? It's how you see yourself and how you experience yourself and how you try to move through the world through your own experiences. And then you have to also be true and accept the fact that society has also shaped how the world sees you, right? And so being an Asian American engaging with Butterfly is really interesting. I mean, I'm Japanese, so the story speaks to me, and I understand on so many levels how this story could have happened. But you know, as someone who is Japanese, I'm always the first person to accept the fact that Japan is the colonizer of the East, right? And does not have great relations with its neighbors, even today, because Japan has not apologized for the horrific things that it's done to its neighbors. But when we're thinking about Asian American, what are we asking for, right? Are we asking for East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, Central Asia, right? Are we Pacific Islands? Are we talking about rich Asia, poor Asia, Muslim Asia, you know, Christian Asia, Catholic Asia? Are we talking about Buddhist Asia? Who are we talking about? Because all of these, even within China, there are something like almost 50 distinct ethnic groups just in China, and they all speak languages that are mutually unintelligible, right? And this is China, just China. So, you know, I think that the nuance that we're talking about right now, I think is really important in starting to decolonize the way that we see Butterfly and the way that we perform Butterfly and that we engage with Butterfly, because it's so much more complicated than Chocho-san is the archetype of Asian woman, right?
Which brings us to another lovely question from the audience listening at home. To what degree is the larger East Asian community involved in these kind of programming decisions? So how do we facilitate having more Asian people controlling how we present Asian people on stage, even if they're Western stories? Any thoughts?
Leadership, creative teams, design teams, valuing all of those roles as being worthy of having multiple diverse voices in them, and bringing the Asian and East Asian populations to those roles, and being able to give a platform for having a voice heard, an opinion said.
But also allowing us to do magic flute as well, or, you know,
And all the things, right? Yeah,
Lapa
exactly.
Lamb.
And not just pigeonholing, but it's, and you know, we've talked about this in many regards with all these discussions, you know, and that goes not only for casting, but I think, you know, who's designing and who's directing as well, that it's not just we're going to give all of the Madama Butterflies to the only Asian directors out there. It's like, no, what else are you letting them direct and design and all those things, that it's not just putting all the people here in the box to do that repertoire, but then having a voice for the rest of the canon that exists.
What is that impact of having somebody from like an Asian director direct Butterfly? Or, you know, what is the impact on you guys as artists when you are asked to trust somebody who's actually from the culture that is being represented in a work? How does that make you guys feel?
Can I go from the other side? I mean,
Yes.
you're asking about an Asian director.
Sure.
I had to do, the last time I had to do Butterfly was the opposite. It was with white, entirely white design team and everything else. So I had I was doing it in Santiago in Chile, and you know, no Asian people to be seen of any stripe in any of the different design jobs or any jobs. And the awkwardness that ensues from that is, I mean, I think you probably addressed it in your book. I would like to have a copy of your book. I guess do I have to buy it?
Everyone should read the
You want me to
book.
buy it? All right. I'll buy it, fine. Subsidizing fellow artists. But just it would have been so helpful to have someone with an actual firsthand experience of the culture and how representations of the culture like make people feel in that environment. And my co-star, also white, had to get him to tame down the yellow face makeup. They were really trying to do yellow face. I mean, this is 10 years ago now, but they were trying to like really do her up. And she was like, let's tone that down a little bit. But there's like, there's nobody there to give insight from the perspective of the race being depicted on stage. This is very, very unacceptable. So I think having, just from that perspective, having experienced that, I think having an Asian directorial staff or designer or makeup consultants even, such as yourself, it's like a breath of fresh air relative to the awkwardness in a white dominated depiction of it. Make me feel like I was from the 19th century.
Where's that awkwardness coming from? Is it because you're doing a disservice to the audience? I mean, are we thinking about this in terms of, what are we actually presenting for the audience? So would having more cultural input make a better artistic product?
Of course. I mean, it goes without saying. I mean, the director, I think, had done some research. He fancied himself an expert in like geisha design and everything else, but I did not speak Japanese, so that I know of. I didn't speak much Spanish, so it was hard to communicate generally.
Actually, my undergrad degree was in geisha science.
Yeah, geishology.
Yes,
Is that how you say it?
exactly.
So I'm sure it could have been worse, but the awkwardness comes from people who don't really know, like trying to tell you that they know.
Yeah.
Something just a comment then that I think that also brings up is then asking the question, like, what is the responsibility of those of us who are not of particular race of the story that's being told to speak up on behalf of that culture as well, and this, regardless of what race it is and regardless of the situation, like, where then do we find the responsibilities in ourselves of being like, okay, I'm part of this interaction and there's nobody here that is of the authority, but then what is the authority, right? And we're like having these conversations about who is the person who should say this is right and this is wrong, but then approaching it from a self-responsibility of being like, I don't think this is right. So how can I use my voice to say this is not right, even though I'm not Japanese or whatever the situation is? I think that and it's tricky because, in the opera industry, there's the hierarchical nature of it. And you're like, do I actually have power to say this, or am I going to get a job anymore? Right. And it's incredibly difficult. But I think something that we have to keep considering too is what power do we have individually to, when we see injustice or whatever it is, use our voice for speaking to the justice.
And the added level of complexity with that is that you have to understand the Japanese people relationship to racism in a place like Chile and what that history is like, right? And this is just trivia, is that the largest population of Japanese people outside of Japan is in South America, right? So you have to understand who are the Japanese people to Chileans, or who are Chileans to Japanese people, and then that's where the conversation starts, right?
And Americans who are also depicted in the opera.
Who are also depicted in the opera, exactly, right? Who are your artists? And so really understanding it from a place of what is my geography, who is engaging in the art, and what is the dialogue that this combination, this formula
And it sounds
spurs.
like anything less than that is a disservice to the audience and will not give you the artistic impact that you desire.
Well, actually, that was my question. How was the opera received? Did the audience like it?
Yeah, I got booed. That happens all the time. I mean, Pinkerton is like, it's awkward.
You deserve it.
I mean, people sort of liked it. It wasn't rousing. I think it would have been much more successful if we had some.
No, because I think the audience would know. I mean, if something, I mean, at least our audience would. If someone presents something like that, you wouldn't get away with that.
No.
Right.
No way.
Well, I think that the difference too is, again, that homogenous versus
melting pot,
diverse community that you're presenting in.
Well, no, music is the universal language. For an opera, you have to be able to sing this part,
Yeah.
and you have to be able to act with your voice. So a lot of the emotion is conveyed in that. The makeup and all that is, most
It actually takes longer to do Yellowface.
right.
than
It
to just
takes
not
away
do
from
it.
from the.
Sidebar, the
I mean,
set
it's
was
ridiculous.
terrible acoustically. So for the music, it was not great.
Yeah.
We were
Well,
all
there you
like
go.
up farthest possible upstage, nothing behind us, all like drapes and everything. I'm like, this
So
is
it's a
not,
schlocky
this is
production, so
Butterfly,
we
come
don't
on.
need to talk about that.
Yeah, you had something to say too.
I mean, everybody kind of said everything I wanted to say. So, but what was interesting hearing Zach speak is I do think there is a side of everyone that wants to authentically tell a story or display something. I mean, there's the musical side of what we do that you were speaking about of, what is how is the music? Could you sing the role? Did you knock it out of the park, or was it kind of like what the acoustics? Did they help you? Did they not? And then there's the kind of emotional, dramatic side to what we do, which also deals with, like the sociocultural context of when the piece was written and what's being depicted. So there's just so much going on. But I think, yes, opera is all about the voice. And I think sometimes I felt like there's two schools of thought on this, where I have many good friends and many fantastic people that train me that felt that if they wanted to see something acted, they would go to a play. They went to an opera to just hear the voice. So, and wonderful. They taught me some amazing, amazing things in terms of vocal technique and how to be able to do what I do. But I think the reason I love opera is there's so many skills you have to master. I don't know. There's just so many skills you kind of have to be in charge of.
Even just breathing is hard enough.
You're telling me,
Yeah.
honestly, like, anyway, so I guess what was interesting hearing Zach talk is I do think that even if it is an all-white cast, there is a kind of desire to depict something authentically, like you want to feel that level of authenticity. And it's difficult because everything that both of you were talking about, like Mel, when you were saying, use your voice, how do you speak out? With me, especially if it's something racial, I think I felt a lot of stuff change over these past few years, which has been very interesting. But I'm someone where I'm like, oh, speaking out does not go well for you, because my life experience has been that when people do that, they get put in their place real quick.
I was more so
no.
talking about white colleagues.
Oh no,
speaking
I know,
on
I know, I
behalf
know,
of those
I know.
folks.
Yeah, but I think it's also hard because there were some things you spoke of in terms of the structural kind of instabilities in our industry. You do have that fear of, am I going to get hired again if I speak out on this? And if you're trying to put food on your table, I mean, you've one kid, two kids. It's just, I feel like we risk so much, and it's just hard. It's like, I don't know. It's such a difficult situation. And I think this process has forced me to ask many questions of like, what will I ask of my white colleagues? What will I ask of myself? Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to survive and like make beautiful art, but that's really difficult, especially in the States. I mean, when you're talking about issues with health insurance, how many of us have muggle jobs, as I call them? There's, we do solo stuff and we do solo work. But sometimes you might have to do a side gig here and there. There's so many things at play in this industry. That it's really, really interesting to kind of ask ourselves these questions of what can I actually do to combat these massive structures and still feel like I'll be able to work and be able to survive. And it's kind of an interesting time to do that. Yeah.
So I just wanted to speak to Nick brought up the word authentic or authenticity in talking about the production design and directing for a show. And I wanted to ask you, Mel, as a director, so who and what are we being authentic to? Are we being authentic to what the actual lived experience in the context of Butterfly, what the actual lived experience in Japan in the time in which the piece is set? Or are we talking about what the composer and librettist, what the context they as Italians were writing this piece in? And how do you as a director wrestle with that? What do you feel that your role is in terms of the composer and librettist's intentions, even in the context of like, I think, personally, I don't think it was Puccini's intent to give an inauthentic or disrespectful portrayal, and he was working with what was available to him as an Italian in a pre-internet world. So I'm curious to hear from you how you reconcile that and what you feel like your role is as a director.
Such a good question, and one that is the biggest hurdle, I think, in deciding, like what is the design and direction of the whole concept of any opera that I personally take on. And I'm just not a monolith for all directors out there, but just my personal process. And to me, it's in deciding what is the essence of the story that I want to tell and being authentic to that direction. And especially when we're talking about pieces that come from the canon and putting them in the historical context of acknowledging where Puccini was when that was being written, or where the librettist was when that was written. For any of these operas that are older, acknowledging that, maybe even being influenced a little bit by being, and taking in that critical information of the historical context, and then putting it in whatever box that I decide to tell the story in, and being authentic then to that vision and that model. Because to me, I think it's going back to why is the story important and what am I trying to say with it, right? And like what, and we've talked about this a lot today, is of like, what is the story? Why does it matter? Why does it not matter maybe? And then being authentic to that vision is where my authenticity lies then as an artist, and bringing on the rest of the team with me in hopefully creating an authentic story that we're trying to emote to an audience. But it's such a good question, because one, especially when there are so many different time periods to consider and so many different circumstances, that what is authenticity, right? And especially when we're talking about the cultural influences then of how much of this culture that I am not a part of do I put in there, and how is that authentic or not authentic, and who do I look at as authorities for the authenticity of that? It's a lot. It's a lot.
Quick question to piggyback on the same conversation. When I think about the aspects that we in the creative team in the opera industry sort of have leeway over changing, I feel like the one thing that stays sort of sacred is the music, barring some unconventional productions, but it sort of feels like that's the thing you can't touch, and you can, so the libretto and the notes on the page stay the same, and then you can change how you direct the piece, you can change what the design concept is. Do you feel though, sorry, this is a leading question, but do you feel like the music itself is tied to the world in which Puccini was writing it, and the vision of the East that he was portraying? Because that's like I said, it's one of those aspects that you can't really change. So do you feel like that hems you in terms of the story that you want to tell? I don't know. How do you, I think about this particularly with Puccini, because I feel like his music is so hyper specific. It's like every single acting beat is there. So it's really hard to sort of change any of how you tell that story.
Absolutely. And hot take, Puccini's not my favorite. That's unpopular opinion. Because of that very reason, because I feel like he's like, this is exactly how you're supposed to feel. And it's like, he manipulates your emotions in that way to be like, this is what you need to feel at this point. It's like not that complex in my opinion.
That's why
Sorry,
I love him.
everybody. In that, no, and complex emotionally in that because there's no discovery to be had. It's like, oh, well, that's what that's supposed to happen. But especially when we're talking about the cultural influence of it, you hear the influence that he had of studying what like authentic Japanese folk tunes were like, and you have that in there. So you can't ignore. I know that there was a question before in one of our previous discussions of, can you ignore the cultural influences of Japan in Madama Butterfly? And you can't, because it's in the music, in the way that he writes that, like it's very inherently there. At least it's,
And it's not an Italian bastardization of what is a Japanese sound. He actually
Yeah.
used actual Japanese folk tunes.
Yeah. And
throughout the
so
piece.
I think that I do often feel tied musically because that's there. And so often what I will do then is look at the libretto and see, okay, I know that is the translation of this, but how can we play with the translation? And, not just for Butterfly, but for other operas too, of being like, well, what is a different way that we can look at this line and the way then what we're saying and what that means? For example, one of the scenes that I did last summer at the Santa Fe Opera was the trio from the Comptoir, which is very, very non-consensual, shall we say, in that manner. And so it was a project for the artist and I to talk about, okay, well, this is what this translates to. How do we put that translation on its head to make a scene that is actually enthusiastically consensual, and sort of, knowing the subtext for that and then altering that and how we're staging it, but also then me asking if it's okay to like slightly alter what the, super titles say when they come up for the audience, so that they're interpreting something that is not something that I want to put on stage, which is, the non-consensual element of that trio that is often laughed at because of the non-consensual nature of it, just to serve as an example. So yes, to answer your question, the music is rather leading in that way. And so I often look to see what I can not alter, but play with in the libretto.
I think it's also really challenging because sometimes these works, like living artists, are still alive when their work that they might have written 50 years ago are being tweaked a little bit. I had a situation I was working on Thoroughly Modern Millie right before the pandemic, with and so it's like, that's something where Dick's still alive, and we're, it's there and it's problematic. And so, how do you deal with situations like that? There are other situations where, I forget which one of the trusts, it might've been the Gershwin estate, where they said, you cannot change. Yeah, you can't change that. But then the question became for the director, well, I'm supposed to say it to this character. Does it mean something different when I say the same line to this character? Or if I break the fourth wall and I say it to the audience and then come back to the scene? Those choices, there's three choices. The way the director wrote it, or the original wrote it, me changing who I'm saying to the same line, or three choices, and they mean three different things, three different dynamics, depending on the choice. So I think even within the rules, the score, Shakespeare's immortal words, right? The part of a creative is to play with it so that it resonates for the people who are alive and who just bought a ticket today, right? That's the audience impact. And so if we're just presenting the work as like, oh, well, they did it last season at Chautauqua this way, so like it's good enough for Chautauqua, it's good enough for us, and let's just do it. And we've been doing it this way for forever, and that's not a problem. Even though the audience has moved on, even within a creator's lifetime. So it's our job. We're not a static art, right? We're not, these are not paintings, these are not films, these are not sculptures. They are not, it's living art. So every time we do a show, we have to think, am I saying this line with a punch that the audience who's alive today is going to go, oh, I felt that. As opposed to, oh, that was cute that they used to sing that way. Yeah.
I have lots of feelings about this particular topic.
Which is why we're here.
And most of this comes from my context being a composer as well as a performer. But my feeling about this, so you're talking about like in the context of you can deliver this line in these three different ways and it could mean totally different things. And that is true. But I also feel like if it is a well-written piece, then I feel like if you fight the composer and the librettist, you always lose.
Hmm.
Unless I feel like unless it was a poorly conceived piece to begin with, there will be specificity in the music, in the text that will say, okay, you can deliver it this other way, but that's not the way. It's not so much that the composer, that a dead composer's intention matters and that we care what he or she thinks, more so just that the process of creating a piece like that, of creating that score, is so intricately woven together that you take out a thread and put it somewhere else, and suddenly the pieces don't make sense in the same way. So I guess my feeling is, if it's clear that the intentions of the source material are problematic, then why are we not doing it? Why are we doing, if it doesn't say the thing that you want to say, then why do the piece and kind of contort it to say something different than what it says? I run into this a lot with Magic Flute, which I just think is a hopelessly problematic piece, and I have no interest in ever seeing again. And I just kind of feel like, why are we constantly bending over backwards to get around the misogyny, the racism, et cetera, when it's obviously there as a part of the piece itself and the way it was originally conceived?
Well, this actually brings up a very good question, similar question from the audience. Thinking about the Oxford Handbook of the Operatic Canon, how can discussions like these change the canon? I mean, how does the canon serve the audience? What purpose does that serve in this case, for example, when something might be outdated, or the views of how we view women or race or gender have moved on as a society, but these works somehow are frozen in time and capture something that might not be true anymore. What do you guys think about that?
Well, something I was going to say before in response to Omar is that let this be a championing cry then for the continuation of new works, right? And celebrating living composers and that whole process. Omar is amazing composer, which, doesn't necessarily speak to changing the canon, but I think maybe it does, because in order to change what the canon is, like, we're the ones who are saying what the canon is, right? Like, the canon is a human-made construct of these are the pieces that we constantly celebrate. So if we're not giving the opportunity for new pieces to be created and also perpetuated, then not just given a world premiere and then forgotten about, but actually like continuing to develop and continuing to be performed, which is what all of the operas in the canon have had a chance to do over the course of hundreds of years. We have to give that time to have that happen in order for us to kind of shift maybe what the canon is. And then I think in terms of then dealing with what is currently the canon, having the interrogative process of, do we need to keep doing this or do we not? And if so, in what way that makes it relevant for 2022 and beyond.
Sell tickets. Yeah, talk about that, Wynne.
Yeah.
Talk about what's that pressure from you as a board member?
It's a lot of pressure
Mhm.
because you just, where do you think the money comes from? You have to get the audience to buy into your concepts, no matter what you're writing. Now, my problem personally with most new operas is that they simply aren't that great. I mean, they're not operas. They're more like scores to a music. Instead of words, you just kind of, well, not even sing it, just say it in a musical way or not. And most people don't really, our ears are not used to it. We're not like that. I mean, a lot of the great works, if you study why they're good, is that they have motifs. They're very clever. Like you guys say, they specifically lead you to a certain emotion, whatever. So, they link certain things. For example, my favorite is the one new piece of work that I really like is Hamilton. I hate rap music. I would not, go near it. But I adored that show just simply because it is so very clever. He was goes this rap music, and all of a sudden he would bring in a lyrical tune to tie everything together. So he would bring you back in again and again to make you much more receptive to the new music and the new concept. So, but I don't think the new opera composers are writing that type of music. They write like we laugh at the board gatherings sometimes. I said, in this new opera, is there one aria that we can sing that we can remember? Just one, not anything. Just give me one line that I can actually remember. Like I just saw Eurydice. I like the music, but one of the people that I saw it with, who's also on the BLO board, he kept saying, I can't sing it. There's no one line that I can remember. I mean, you know, and
So you need an earworm.
yeah, well, we need something, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
mean, you know.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay, hi. Just to kind of piggyback from all of this, I think that as artists and creators, the canon will exist and can exist as a library for all of us to look back and learn from, and then further channel that creativity. And I didn't chime in before, but I love how we all have different backgrounds and everything. And thinking about, okay, do I really know anybody who looks like me? If you were to ask me what ethnicity I was, people would think anything but Cuban. So just because I'm so mixed for such a long time. And I love the idea of new works coming through because they talk about our present reality and how the world right now, even internationally, is becoming more and more connected, more and more of a melting pot that 100 years ago or even 50 years ago didn't really exist. So I also agree with what you were saying about sometimes new works don't cater to the mass public in the sense of like, why is popular music so popular? Because it's ringy, for someone who has a factory job or, a 9-to-5 corporate job, they're not really in the mood to listen to something. Well, they may be, but I guess most people could be looking for something as a release to help them escape from that reality. That I think as performers and creators, it's good to receive that feedback, to maybe think, maybe people want to feel different than like the static life that they may live, or maybe they want to feel more joy, or they want to feel even, sadness. They want to feel something deep, but that can also be approachable to them. That 20th century music doesn't or hasn't really catered too much of like for the popular demand, but it's kind of twofold. We can educate the audience in the sense of having them understand the depth of the musicality, but also encourage composers to write music that is approachable to people who otherwise would have never gone to an opera, because that kind of style is just, they can't really, they're not interested in. So
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I think this is such a fascinating topic, and I deal with this a lot when we talk about decolonial aesthetics in my work at Harvard, and it's so interesting to think about your own aesthetic in your own ear and what influenced that, right? And I think I'm a guest teaching artist at Longy this year, and I'm lecturing on, and I'm coaching students on Japanese art song, which has been really interesting for me to research because I didn't have that education in my schooling. But there's this very, very abrupt and pivot in the Japanese tonal aesthetic right around the Meiji Restoration, which is when Butterfly was written. And you can hear the American influence. You can hear it. You can hear the Western influence. There's actually a Dutch man who actually came in and rewrote all of we had like school songbooks, replaced them all with really tonal, Western tonality, right? But just before this Western influence in the US, or in Japan, before Japan even opened its borders to foreigners, the music was non-tonal. The concept of time was so different than 4/4, 2/4, 3/4, 9/8, right? Something that is so square and measurable, right? Didn't exist. The vocalism was so guttural and so right. And that was what was popular music in Japan before Western influence. So understanding that our ears now are a result of colonial influence, and how do we make space for non-Western sounds, and I'm thinking about like cultures that have microtonality, right? And how we slide between semitones and how we can accept that as music. And then say, well, now we have to make space for it. And now we have to support this kind of music and give people an opportunity to write that music and to fail or succeed so that they can learn how to grow and how we can influence the collective aesthetic. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's so interesting. And I think about this a lot because I very clearly have my musical aesthetics. But I always have to think like, why do I like this? And do I like this because this is my own spirit that is connecting to this? Or was I conditioned throughout my lifetime to think that this is beauty?
Well, I think we've got a lot to think about in terms of audience impact here. Bruno Mars, Taylor Swift, if you're listening, we need new operas and BLO will commission them from you. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you guys got something out of this in terms of thinking a little bit deeper about the impact of works like Butterfly in terms of how we move these works forward into the future to make sure that these works are still alive and impactful for our audiences, even going into the 21st century. Gosh, we're getting old, right? Thank you again to the Boston Public Library for hosting us today. And we have a couple closing words from our hosts.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your conversation, and thank you to our audience for joining us virtually today. Two programs that are coming up that you may want to keep an eye on are our opera nights with the Boston Lyric Opera here at the Boston Public Library. There will be April 27th and June 2nd, both at 6 p.m. And more information on those will appear on our websites in the near future. To find out more about resources, services, and programs for people of all ages here at the Boston Public Library, please visit us at bpl.org. And you can find out more about the Butterfly process and other programs and performances from the Boston Lyric Opera at blo.org. And those links are in the chat. Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon. Take care and be well. Good night.